What is shaking, everybody? It is a brand new episode of the Wind Up Podcast, and I'm your host, Mike of MTGA Wines. We are diving into a futuristic conversation today. This is coming out a little bit late. This was the first week, I think, in the last year of doing this that I had like a full-on writer's block. Typically, many of you know, we try and release these on Wednesday. I'm definitely recording and publishing this on Friday, the 15th of March. As I got into my normal routine to start the week, kind of Sunday, Monday is when I start putting together kind of the bullet points of what I talk about. I try to record, on Monday or Tuesday, even Wednesday morning, just kind of as time allows in and around life and work and all those things. And probably 2 or 3 times I got in front of the computer, I got everything queued up, the mic was hot and ready to go, and I just could not figure out exactly what I wanted to talk about. And I think it was like paralyzation due to the number of options. There have been some pretty interesting conversations we've had over the last week about the future of Napa, the future of the wine industry, the future of barrels, the future of, our own wines, the future of other brands and how they're kind of perceiving where this, last year ended and how this first quarter is going. It is a very interesting time. And I don't think I realized that until the last couple of weeks. So we're going to dive into all of that today. This is going to be a little bit of a mailbag kind of episode where we're going to talk about a few different topics and probably expand on them as this year continues. It's going to be an interesting one. Excuse me. There's a whole bunch of stuff to get into. But before we do, a couple of quick announcements. As always, appreciate you all for tuning in, downloading, rating, reviewing the show. Please continue to share it with your wine-loving friends. That is a huge help. If you do have a hot second to put a little rating or review down wherever you're consuming your podcast, that would be outstanding. It's a huge help. If you're not following us on any of our social networks, be sure to do that. It's where we post more kind of up-to-date and like day-to-day winery operations and things of that nature. If you're just interested in the inner workings of a wine business and how the world goes around for us, at MTGA Wines is our handle on the Book of Face, Instagram, the social network formerly known as Twitter, and of course our YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is also a great resource for any of our tasting notes, both for older vintages, current releases, videos kind of about our day-to-day operations. So if you're just really into how the wine industry kind of kicks along and you want to see it firsthand, any one of those are a great place to follow. We try and post everything everywhere as best we can. So thank you all for following, subscribing, rating, reviewing, all of the things. Very much appreciated. Now, you have to excuse me. I've had like this little frog in my throat for the last couple of days. That's the other thing. It's like a little scratchy for some reason. I don't know why. If you hear a pause, that's because I'm taking a sip of water to try and tamper it down a little bit. But we'll get through it. We can persevere. If that's the only thing I have to worry about today, that would be lovely. So about this writer's block, the issues that kind of really, it was like the dam was starting to break over the last week. Here's all this stuff. Maybe it was because of just kind of the emotion behind last week's episode and talking about, or maybe 2 episodes ago, I can't even remember which one it was. They are all kind of a blur once I get them posted. But talking about Premier Napa Valley and, sitting and being around kind of the heavy hitters and the big fish, in the room when it comes to the wine business out here. And a lot of those conversations were just super, super interesting. And it's always amazing how kind of off the cuff and easy they are, just because of how, this industry is just such a tight-knit community that it doesn't really matter how big or small you are. There's this amazing common ground that we all have, and that is that we are all just crazy enough to want to do this for a living. And we do it. Many of us for the love of the game. A few of us try to, make as much money as they can and cash out whenever they can. That's definitely not how we do things, but there are definitely those, and we've talked about some of those brands on the show. But there's been a few kind of key things that I don't think I've really gotten into in the show just yet. And the kind of overarching theme for so many people going into this new year, and now as we're kind of getting through this first quarter, is the downturn in business and visitation within the Napa area over the last 18 months or so. In late 2022 and all of 2023, it fell off like a cliff. And many of us kind of blamed it on like the post-COVID, like, hey, there are other places that are now opened up. People are more comfortable traveling. Napa had its really big, great year in 2021 because people were traveling domestically. So this is just the leveling out of everything. And then 2023 came and we're like, all right, well, this is interesting because now it's just continuing to kind of take this nosedive. And pretty much there are a handful of people, close friends and colleagues that we talked to that are like, oh, 23 was rough, but we ended up having a good year regardless, especially given the situation that most of the Valley found itself in. We were certainly one of those people, but there were many that were down 10, 20, 30%, not just in visitation, but overall revenue. And people are kind of reeling, trying to figure out like, holy shit, how do we bounce back from this? And they're looking at 2024 as like, all right, hopefully 23 is just this big dip. And now we see it kind of level back out and kind of rise back to where we want it to be. Based on the conversations I've had, it's been a pretty slow start to the year for many. They're starting to see kind of appointments and things pick up for the second quarter, but not yet to the volume in which they would expect. So there's this kind of like undercurrent of worry and kind of trepidation about how 2024 is really going to shake out for people. It's very interesting. This is also carried over into, other industries that are associated with the wine industry, especially after talking about that grape report. And I know a lot of you enjoyed kind of the geeky like numbers details of the costs of, grapes and why things kind of are the way they are in the grape market, that insider kind of look into things. But even our barrel producers, there have been 3 of my barrel cooperages that I purchased barrels from over the last 2 weeks that have seen the rising cost of doing business in Napa in particular when it comes just to the grape costs. They are seeing people looking for ways to make more affordable wines, and that is a relative term, but as affordable as they can, given what they're trying to, where they want their wines to be. And they're saying, there's actually a fair amount of not necessarily waste, but things that we can do as producers of barrels to help alleviate that. There are 2 of my cooperages in particular that I've been using for a very long time that are introducing cheaper barrels that are in essence made from, wood that would not necessarily qualify for their higher end barrels. In essence, becomes scrap and used for other things if it's used at all. But they're saying, hey, maybe these barrels aren't quite as good, or, maybe they don't integrate quite as well. But if you're looking for, a barrel that's, 200, 300, 400 euro less than what you're paying for your other ones, that's a great way to cut some costs and reduce the overall impact of on the price of your wine. You have a lot of folks also talking about this adolescent phase that Napa seems to be going through, and it's easy to look at Napa and be like, well, they're the king, like we are the shining star of the wine industry within the United States, depending who you ask. But we certainly have that kind of pomp and circumstance. And frankly, I think we're officially kind of that, star quarterback on the high school football team. That's kind of where Napa is. You're in this like teenage kind of adolescent phase, trying to figure out what adulthood is going to look like. And realistically, we don't have much of a clue, and we're sorting it out as we go. That definitely seems to be the case. And now you have, amongst all those other things, with the increase in grape prices, going up close to 40% over the last 4 years, you have people trying to manage their their pricing and try not to increase things too crazy for their clients. You have folks that are like, we have to take price increases, but we're really worried that we're gonna alienate our customer base. You have folks that are the ones that did really well last year, kind of the outliers. Then they have inventory management problems where they're like, we're selling out of wine faster than we can make it, and our costs are going up so high that revenue is not accounting for these additional costs. So we're actually potentially operating at a deficit, even though we're selling out of wine. It is all this stuff has been bouncing around my head over the last probably 5 days or so. And it's taken to this point for me to finally put some bullet points together and figure out kind of my thoughts on all of these things. So we're going to work our way through it a little bit. And we'll start from the top, going back to kind of the downturn of visitation and revenue in Napa, and kind of integrate this Napa's like adolescent phase idea into it. It's an interesting concept, right? That Napa's in its adolescence, because, it's easy to look at it as the elephant in the room when it comes to the wine industry in the U.S. I mean, obviously Napa Cabernet and just Napa wines in general are in such high demand. It's hard to be like, oh, well, they're just kind of working out the kinks still. Keep in mind that, wine has been made in Napa since the late 1800s. You subtract quite a few years due to Prohibition, but it really didn't start coming back into the foray until the 60s. And even then, it took until the late 70s and winning the Paris tasting in 76, where it was like, oh, hey, here we are. Let's do this thing. And this actually ties into the barrel conversation as well, surprisingly enough, but more on that in a second. And so let's say, let's give it the 60s just to be generous. We'll give it an extra decade. We're talking 60 years of real winemaking history, even though it goes back obviously further than that to the likes of the Behringer brothers and things, where in the late 1800s, people were making wine out here. But, we can all look back at Prohibition and blame it for like, oh, well, obviously Napa could have been something grander sooner, but there was this nice little hiccup of a constitutional amendment that kind of got in the way of things. So even though it's been, wine's been made here for 140 years or more, it's still very much in its adolescence, because you didn't see kind of the commercial aspect of it and the success of it really happen until the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 90s. It's a very recent phenomenon. So when we see these peaks and valleys in terms of like visitation and like the shifting of culture of wine buying, where it used to be going through your local restaurant, going through your local retailer, that is how wine is bought and sold far more often than doing a wine club or an allocation list. That is a very new world, and especially a Napa thing. The direct business is something that has been hugely beneficial for small producers like ourselves, but even some of the larger ones that have created these grand hospitality centers to host hundreds or thousands of people a day. I mean, in their height, like Domaine Chandon, for example, I think they're now by appointment, but they were hosting thousands of people in a single day. Like, it was literally an adult Disneyland. The vibe was crazy. It was nuts. And then you have other places that started to do this like more, qualified, more intense, more thoughtful, I think, personalized tasting experiences where it's like, hey, you're the only group on property today. Let's sit down for a couple of hours and go through this. You're not just going to belly up to a bar and taste a few things and hightail it out of there. It's a huge shift. And that came along with kind of this rising tide of these high-end wines, kind of this cult wine scene, and how price points were kind of skyrocketing and the cost of doing business was going up, and you saw wines getting more and more expensive. And it was, I think, kind of this natural progression. And it's why I truly believe that Napa is kind of in this adolescent, star quarterback phase where it's like, hey, you're really good right now. Wait till you get to college and you start playing with, the top 1% of high school players or whatever, kind of anyone who's competed in a high school sport and then gotten into a college sport or even made it into the professional level. Like the margin for error and how good you are really starts to equalize when you start competing against the best of the best from all around the country, right? That's just natural, as you might expect. It's why achieving that is such a great accomplishment for so many. And Napa is kind of in that phase of like, all right, we've made it to being that star, top recruit from high school. Now we got to get to the next level, and we got to do it just as well there as we are doing it right now. And it really, the reason that this kind of conversation came up and with some friend groups over the last week is because we started comparing ourselves back to France and saying, well, what has happened over the years in these wine regions that have been going, making wine since the Roman Empire? What has been going on in these other places that have been making wines, not just for, 60 or 80 years or 140 years, but thousands of years? What has happened? What has transpired? And Bordeaux is a great example because you see, in essence, the first and second growths of the left bank. You see the Chateau Petrusses and Cheval Blancs of the right bank. And this upper echelon of Grand Crus and first growths that kind of command the presence and kind of this high end of nature where things are going for hundreds, if not thousands of bottle, right? And then you have literally everybody else. There's a lot of other producers in Bordeaux outside of those that I just mentioned in those classifications. There's a bunch. You don't necessarily hear about them. They don't necessarily make it out of France, or maybe they make it around Europe a little bit more, but they stay pretty close to home. And I think it's a great lesson to learn for where Napa is headed. I think if I, shake my crystal ball and I guess where we're going to be in the next, 60 years of wine production, and we, have been going at it for 120 years now consistently in Napa, it's going to be that. You're going to have the big names, the big chateaus, so to speak, the first growths kind of at that top level. And you're going to see other labels and other brands start to kind of segment themselves down from there. Utilizing actually Joseph Phelps is a great example of this. Using someone like Camus and their Special Select is a great example of this, where you have kind of these big names in the room that realistically aren't that hard to find. They make pretty quality wine for what it's worth. They're a high price point as well. I think even like Farniente, I had a friend of mine that visited, or actually might have been my brother, Garrett, that visited Farniente. And he was like, holy shit, like most of their wines are like $300, $400 a bottle. They have like their everyday cab at like $180 or like $200 or something like that. And it's like, all right, when you think of, the first growths of Bordeaux and your Chateau Margaux and Latours and things, you're like, okay, well, those are the ones going for hundreds of dollars a bottle, more than that in the really great vintages. And then there's everybody else. And I think that's what we're starting to see, is we're starting to see this segmentation within Napa of the folks that are willing to be that big name and kind of do a lot of the carrying of the weight of like the Napa brand. And then there's going to be a lot of cool stuff underneath that, because you can go all the way down those second, third, fourth, fifth growths and find things that are out fucking standing in terms of the quality, especially for the price point. You don't necessarily have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars a bottle to enjoy a good wine. And that's kind of the beautiful thing. And I think Napa is starting to hopefully figure that out, where there are a lot of people who have gotten into this industry in the last 10, 15 years who are like, hey, if we don't price our Cabernet at $1.75 or $2.25, what are we doing? And they immediately dive in head first into that upper echelon, thinking that their shit doesn't stink, that they can just command that market share like anybody else. And I don't think that's true. I think you are starting to see not necessarily pushback, but you're like, hey, your wine is $2.25, your wine's $3.25. These big names who have been doing it for decades longer than you have, who have this winemaker and these accolades and all this other stuff going for them. Like, them pricing their wine at that makes sense. They have this pedigree. You're the new kid on the block. What makes you think that you can compete with them? And I think that is a question that some people in the industry, not necessarily consumers outside of the wine industry, but I think for us, there's a lot of people that if they're not asking that question, they should be. Now, some of it comes down to, the cost of doing business out here, right? We talked a lot about the cost of grapes, the cost of barrels, things of that nature. And it can be very expensive to make these wines. And if you're only making a few hundred cases or a few thousand cases, you have to price your wine a certain way to make your business work, right? Because if you're making 12,000 bottles of wine and only making $5 a bottle, that's $60K a year. Is that enough to net to make it make sense from a business perspective, to pay your bills, to live here, to work here, to do all those things? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not. But it is interesting, as I mentioned, the barrel program. I had a really great conversation with Lucas of Alain Fouquet. Shout out to Alain Fouquet. He was, I've come to find out, a real pioneer in the way barrels are sold. And it was because of Napa. I found this out, and this is what Lucas told me, and I'm paraphrasing, so buddy, if you're listening, I apologize. I probably am going to screw something up. But Alain brought a cooperage by the name of Segan Moreau to the U.S., which many of us know within the industry. Some of you have probably seen their barrels and cellars if you've done some cave tours and barrel tastings, things of that nature. And what he found out when he brought this cooperage over and started getting it ramped up was that, one, we're making wine very differently. And it wasn't so much the style, but it was like, hey, we are very focused on kind of the origin of our wines. That, hey, it's coming from this specific vineyard. It's made this specific way with these specific barrels. And what I found interesting, what Lucas told me, is that the French typically were a little bit less concerned about what barrels they were using. They just wanted good quality barrels. They're like, let me buy some from you, some from you, some from you. And actually next year, we bought enough this year, we're going to skip this year. We're not going to buy any new barrels. And we're just going to use the ones we got because we don't need to buy anymore. Like there was this weird, just like, it wasn't quite as like dialed in. It wasn't quite as, I don't know, like the business just hadn't quite formed in the way that, we think of it in the US, where it's like, hey, I use these specific barrels for this specific wine, where the French are like, yeah, we got barrels, just throw wine in it. It'll be great. It was a little bit more haphazard. I'm sure there was plenty of tasting done. I'm sure there was a lot of due diligence done, that at a certain point, it mattered a lot less. And we were talking about the Nevers forest in particular of oak, because it's a favorite of many winemakers out here. They just love the style that those oak trees provide to wines. And I mentioned, like, hey, there's a cooperage that used to do like these specific like forest designate, like, hey, we're producing wood just from this forest for this one barrel. It's not some amalgamation of all these different forests, which is traditionally how it was done. It was like, hey, we're going to take great wood from a few different places, blend it together. That way you have a very solid barrel that does a lot of things for you. Basically, that's kind of the gist of it. But the U.S. and the Napa wine market in particular really keyed into the idea of, hey, we need like that. We want this specific wine from this specific vineyard to go into this specific barrel from this specific forest. And it started to revolutionize what the barrel programs meant to many winemakers. And Alain was one of these guys that actually realized that. And they started to slowly shift how barrels were sold because of how we in Napa were buying them. We wanted the specificity and we wanted certain things. And he was one of the guys that kind of pioneered that, from what I understand. And as a result, a lot of cooperages adapted what he was doing and said, hey, this is how we're going to make a killing in this new world of wine, is we're going to make specific barrels just for these producers that dial in these details. It was a fascinating conversation of how it went from this, yes, we're going to use these forests and we're going to focus on the millimeters in between the grains of the wood and the quality, to, hey, we need to make that quality from this specific site, from these specific trees, and really dial in those details. To kind of an outrageous point. is really interesting because it's somewhat how I view our barrel program, but it's almost like I'm just kind of looking for these good containers that impart good characteristics. The forest to me is less important. Still a factor, but it's not my number one like qualifier when I'm buying barrels typically, right? So you had this shift in these barrel productions and it was more expensive. You have these, I'm trying to tie it all together here a little bit. That was a little bit of a tangent, but interesting in terms of like barrel history and how things evolve within a business. I find this kind of stuff fascinating. And I mean, what that did is now you have these very specific, very high-end barrels being produced where you're being charged 1,200 euro, 1,300 euro. I just got a bill for, I think, 1,400 a couple days ago for a barrel that I needed. And the barrel producers are also saying, hey, look at how expensive these grapes are. Look at how expensive these wines have to be in order to make these businesses make sense. Can we keep producing enough barrels for all of these wines? And between Alain Fouquet, Sylvain, and I'm sure other cooperages are going to follow suit, they're starting to utilize wood that they would deem as typically lesser quality, that it's not necessarily what they're going to put into their barrels, but they're like, hey, we have in essence all this wood that we're not using. How can we is it possible for us to make a more affordable barrel that's maybe 200 euros cheaper, 400 euros cheaper, something that producers can utilize, that they want this nice toastiness. They want certain characteristics that only barrels can provide. You can't use oak dust for it. You can't use oak chips for it. You can't add extract to achieve it. You need barrels for it. But can we do it at a lower price point? And you have these producers starting to shift that direction and testing the waters with some of these more affordable barrels. To the point where maybe not this year, but next year, I'm probably going to do a barrel trial with a few of these and line up 2 or 3 of them and say, hey, let's try our cab in a neutral barrel, the brand new barrel that we love using, the higher end stuff, and then let's try these other kind of what would be, cheaper and more cheerful barrels and see how it works. And can we cut our barrel costs down by, 400, 200 euros per barrel, and hopefully not have to continue to raise prices, so you have kind of that shift within just the cooperages and the barrel makers, where they're seeing kind of this shift and where Napa has gone in terms of its price points and popularity, very similar to how France, I think, evolved in terms of how those classifications kind of came down the pipeline. And they're trying to figure out, how do we adapt to the next thing coming down that pipeline? And I think that is a fascinating conversation and interesting how there are a handful of people that are already diving into that. I mean, shoot, we're already diving in that. We have 2 wines now. We have a Napa Valley Cabernet that's $55 a bottle. It's juice that we are not going to use in our MTGA cab. Frankly, it's stuff that was good but not good enough. We have a white wine that we're doing for $20 a bottle. And that's something that we're starting to get out into the world in the next few months, because we can either sell that juice as bulk wine, as many of you have heard me talk about, and lose money on it right now, especially the way the bulk juice market is right now. It's flooded with availability. So you're not going to get any coin for it realistically. Or you can take the time to bottle that up and find a way to, maybe make a little bit of squirrel on the side, a little bit of scratch on the side. Squirrel? Why did I say squirrel? I meant scratch. Is squirrel a cash term? I'm pretty sure it is. Maybe. I don't know. But it's something that we're not, if we were to focus on just those couple of wines and make those exclusively, we wouldn't last long in business. But because we have enough juice to go around and more than we need for kind of our higher end wines, we can cut some from the herd and say, hey, we're not going to make nearly as much. One of those wines, in fact, at the price we're selling it, I'm making like 50 cents on the bottle. Realistically, it's not a, hey, we're going to get rich here. Unless we start making 1 million bottles of it, then that probably make a little more sense. But, it's not that's the kind of scale that you'd have to get to really make a killing, right? And when you're making a couple barrels of it, 50 cents every bottle you sell is that's a tight margin you're working with. But it's something, it's like, hey, we can either make a little bit or lose money because of what we already spent, and no one's going to buy this juice at the price we want to sell it at. Anyway, I think you're seeing that shift for some people where they're trying to figure out, okay, we're making these high-end wines. That part of the business is doing well. We're starting to see these ripple effects of downturns in visitation or revenue. There's more competition. People are, tightening their belts maybe a little bit. Always happens in an election year anyway. So we got that going on, which will be super exciting as this year goes on. Oh, I don't think any of us are stoked for it, but whatever, we're here. And you see like there's just kind of this rippling effect of these conversations of, where are these high-end wines going? Can we continue to hold our price points steady, or do we have to take these increases? Can we find cheaper materials that still do a great job in terms of these barrels that are there, that cooperages are trying to make more affordably for us specifically? It is a wild time to kind of like look at all this stuff that's being thrown at the wall, all these conversations, because if it continues on the current trend, right? And this is a conversation I actually had with my brother. We were going down. One of the reasons we didn't release this episode and kind of get to this on Wednesday is we ended up going into the city. He had a fitting. He's getting married in about a month and a half, taking the plunge. We were going to go to a fitting for his suit. We had to go to San Francisco for it. And we were doing that for pretty much all day Wednesday to get back here. But this was the conversation we had. Actually, we had dinner the night before on Tuesday night, and we talked a little bit about this and more about it in the car, just about producers in general, where you have folks kind of considering, price increases because grapes are more expensive, because barrels are more expensive, because staffing and overhead are just more expensive. And also on top of that, you have a handful of folks, within the industry that actually had a pretty good 2023. There's very few of us, but some of us did all right. And some wines are just continuing to sell out at an outrageous pace. But the cost of doing business has gotten to a point where those margins have been they just have deteriorated at an outrageous rate. And now, even though you're making this great wine and you're selling it incredibly fast, it's not enough money coming in the door to necessarily make up for the rising costs of what we're doing. So people are considering price increases, as you might expect. You're like, hey, costs are going up. That gets passed along somewhere. So they're trying to figure this inventory management out. Like, we're selling out so fast, the dollars coming in are worth less because how much these wines and how much this business costs to operate. We have to take a price increase. And it was a great point he made, is that from a sales perspective, because he works more in sales and hospitality. I'm on the winemaking side. He's kind of the front of the house guy. And he's like, what we don't want, his big concern, and I really appreciate this concern, and I think it's what any one of us in this industry think about, is that we do not want to alienate the clients that got us here. It's like, don't forget who supported you, in the early days. You don't want to take that 10, 15, 20% hike in, price and alienate the people that have been supporting you. You don't want to have a bunch of wine club attrition. You want to make sure your business stays healthy. And you want to make sure that people continue buying your wine. So if you're going to raise your price, you got to do it really, really thoughtfully. You can't just arbitrarily say, hey, you know what? We're taking everything up 20% this year. And some people do that. Some people absolutely do that. There's a very large producer that Jim, out in Missouri. I know you're going to talk shit about this when we see each other later this year, in about a month, 2 months, right? Name names, but I'm not gonna this time. I'll tell you when I see you in Missouri. But there's a large producer, one of the more popular ones that's, distributed all over the country here, that, raised their prices over the last year. And they're working with one of the biggest retailers in the country. What happened though was, with that price increase, that means that their wine has to go into like the glass case. if you've ever been into like that Bevmo or that Total Wine, or whatever the case is, like there's always like the high end stuff that's like locked up. You can't just like grab it off the shelf, right? So their wine used to be on the shelf. Now it has to be in the glass case because of the price point. And they're saying, hey, realistically, if you're going to be in that glass case, you're going to sell less wine because less people will shop there. You're naturally alienating a certain segment of our clientele because of where your price point is. And if you're that big producer and you're relying on, I don't know, but I'd probably guess tens of thousands of cases to be sold through a certain retail chain, that might hurt your bottom line a little bit. And then you get all the inventory management issues of like, shoot, now we have this glut of wine that we can't sell because it's moving so slow because we took our price increase in a direction that isn't going to work for certain people, for the vast majority of our customer base, potentially. Crazy conversations. But going back to the conversation I was having with Garrett, it was, what if? Here's like the big what if. It's like, okay, we're making less money on these wines because it's so expensive to do business, but this wine was supposed to last us until the next release, right? Let's say we released this wine in the spring and we released the older vintage last May. We sold out of it. Excuse me, that frog in my throat kind of caught up to me. Refreshing H2O. We released it last May. It was supposed to last until this May or maybe April. If we sold out of it a little early, that's fine. But we sold out of it in November. We're out of this wine. We're going to have, 6 months of none of this wine to sell. And it's funny, the same conversation kind of came up with a buddy of mine at the gym yesterday. He's in the construction world. He's like, I keep doing all these renovations, particularly like bathroom renovations, things of that work. And he's like, I'm working like crazy. Frankly, I got too much work. And the first thing I said it without even thinking about it. I was like, time to raise your prices. And he looked at me and he's like, huh. And I saw the light bulb go off because it's like, you can do less work and get paid more. Because if you're doing a great job and people are willing to pay that price, you can weed out certain clientele and do a really great job. Not everyone's going to be able to afford X number of dollars per hour for you to do that work. But if you can work for less people and make roughly the same amount of cash, it's not a bad idea. So that's where the conversation went with Garrett and I was like, maybe you need to stretch that wine for 5 more months so you can get to that next release. Maybe that means you have to take that price increase, which means people are going to buy less of that wine in volume. But because of the price increase, you're able to make, in essence, the same amount, if maybe not a little bit more money, and stretch the length of life that wine has in the market or in terms of its availability. And Garrett was like, that's not a bad point. I'm not saying that that's the right choice to make. I'm not saying that that is the direction that any business should go, but it's an option and it's a conversation that's worth having. But you don't want to end up like that big producer I just mentioned and alienate a certain segment of your customer base and then be up a shit creek with no paddle, right? You don't want to have to worry about your inventory management on the opposite side of things where it's like, hey, selling out too fast can be a problem. Also, not selling enough wine can be a huge problem. And there's a fine ass line that you got to walk in between those two things. It's, I don't even know. Looking into this conversation about kind of the future, and there are so many people having these conversations right now in the Napa wine industry. Probably, I'm guessing it's not just unique to us. I'm sure there are other places around the country, even the world, that are trying to figure this kind of stuff out. But for us going through this adolescent phase that I truly believe we're in, where we've been, king shit for a while now. And guess what? There's a new, bigger kid that just transferred into our high school who's going to compete for our quarterback spot. And we're going to have to show that guy up somehow, some way. And maybe we do, maybe we don't. It's going to be a very I don't think a lot of this is going to change, barring something crazy happening economically or politically or whatever. I don't think this is going to be something that changes dramatically in a short period of time. This is more of like that 5, 10 to 20 year like conversation of like, where are we headed long term, which many of you know who listen to this, like the wine industry is a long game you play. It's not a turn on a dime kind of business. It's something that takes a long time to really make these shifts and these turns. But if you read the tea leaves even a little bit, you can see kind of where things are going. And when you have conversations like this and all these points we talked about today happening more and more frequently, more and more regularly, it means that there's an undercurrent taking people somewhere. People understand that there is this uneasiness, there's a shift happening. Where it actually ends up, none of us have any idea. We don't have that kind of crystal ball out here. I would love one though, that'd be super cool. Have all the monies in the wine industry if you had that, if you knew what wine was going to be popular, what price point was going to be popular, how things were going to work. All of us could use that in our respective industries, I'm sure. But at a certain point, I think this is, this is probably lack of a better turn of phrase, but I don't really think there's any other way to go about this. There's probably someone out there with a much smarter business, economical brain than mine that has a better idea. But for me personally, at this stage of the game where we are having these conversations, talking about these things, it's a gut check. You need to take this information, absorb it, analyze it, look at your business, what's working, what's not. And if needed, you need to throw a baby out with the bathwater, figuratively, of course. And if it's working, don't try and fix it. Be diligent, don't be ignorant to the fact that it could be on a wrong path. It just hasn't hit that, right turn just yet. Be willing to evaluate, be willing to be critical, and be willing to have these tough conversations about the future and where you really want to end up. Because if you're not paying attention to this stuff, if you're just having these conversations and saying, oh, well, that was kind of a crazy conversation, and you shrug it off as if nothing's going on, you're going to be up that creek with no paddle in a hurry. I guarantee it. Whoa, that was a long one. I'm going to have to go for a walk after this episode. I'm not even kidding. Like my brain is just scrambled with all of this. And I am so curious, excited, nervous about where all these conversations end up going, where this industry ends up shifting to, and how, all of us within this industry and all of you as fans of, the wine industry, where we all end up in this. This is that kind of stuff that it's not like this is some like crazy make or break, hey, the wine industry is going to make it or it's not. It's, nothing like that. It's not nearly that dramatic. But it is going to really impact a lot of producers and how they operate, whether or not they survive the next few years. It's going to be a ride. If nothing else, it's going to be a ride. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I appreciate your patience and understanding as we continue to kind of grow and figure this show out. This was probably, I'm glad I waited to do this episode. This has been probably the most fun I've had recording an episode in quite a few weeks. It was starting to feel a little bit like work for a couple of months there. And I think it was just like the winter gloom of it being rainy and cold. And finally we got some sunshine, some vitamin D. I've been driving Topanga, the bus around a little bit, which has been really, really exciting. It's just nice to be out and about in the sunshine. I'm not going to lie. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another episode on sometime around March 20th. We'll try and get it out on Wednesday and not continually post things late. Quick reminder for everybody, please submit your questions. We do have our March question and answer episode coming up on the 27th. You can slide into our DMs on any of those social networks I mentioned at the beginning. That's at MTGA Wines. You can find us, dive into our YouTube channel and post comments in the comment section under our videos, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can in that episode in a couple of weeks. One more order of business, that as we get into April, I'm going to be on the road all of the time. So we are doing events in Kansas City. We're doing events in St. Louis. We're actually, the Chicago event in mid-April is sold out already. If you have any interest in joining us in some of these events in the Midwest, please head to our website, mtgawines.com. There'll be a link to our shop where you can go and buy tickets to some of those events. We are going to be, I'm heading to Pittsburgh at the end of the month. I'm going to be in Des Moines. I'm going to be in Missouri again, actually. I'm going to be in the Pacific Northwest. We're going all over the place, just slanging that wine. So hopefully we will see you out on the road. Exciting times. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Love you guys. Mean it. Catch you later. This has been the Wind Up Podcast. Do I do like an official signing off? Do I say that now? I guess that's the thing now. We'll see you later.